You're listening to the Subrogation Support Network, a podcast from Mathieson, Wickert & Layer, America's subrogation law firm, with dissemination of new developments and changes in subrogation law, as well as emerging trends and best practices. Here's your host, Ashton Kirsch.
Hello, everyone. This is Ashton Kirsch, your host with the Subrogation Support Network podcast. It's a pleasure to be here with you today for another fascinating topic. So this last week, well, first off, I've been traveling like crazy. I was at PLRB in Boston for a few days. From PLRB, I came back home to pick up my family to go to the airport to go on spring break. Travel to two different places to then fly back 10 days later to fly directly off to San Francisco for CLM, to then afterwards get in the car and drive out to Cedar Rapids for some meetings. So it has been insane. I'm back and I'm exhausted, but I'm also still happy to be here. During my travels, I had the pleasure of speaking at PLRB and CLM on similar topics, nuclear negotiations, training adjusters, attorneys on best tips and tricks in negotiating, which, as I'm sure most of you know, you've either been through my presentations, gone to our firm webinars, or listened to some of the snapshots that I touch on in a few of these podcasts. And, I was thinking about what to talk about today. And one of the topics that really came to mind and was pretty impactful at both of the presentations at PLRB and CLM was the first impression principle, and how we use this psychological principle of first impressions to impact how we pursue and negotiate subrogation claims. So today I figured I'd talk about, briefly, this shouldn't be that long of a podcast today because, I could talk to you for hours, but ultimately we'll hit on the main things, those being why first impressions are key, how the psychological principle actually comes into play in communications, how we can use that in our demand strategies, how best practices for demands, and what the max amount of time we should spend in between demands, and before we kind of escalate this for litigation. We'll give some examples that I give during this presentation, and from there we'll kind of talk about the idea of anchoring. And there's a psychological heuristic called the anchoring and adjustment heuristic that comes into play when we're trying to determine the right amount to make in a demand letter, right? What is that amount going to be? Is there anything additional we can ask for? Subrogation claims are pretty static, but there's a few things we'll touch on there. So let's jump into it. So first impressions are key, right? They say that all the time. Whenever you're dealing with communications, everyone knows when you're going to a job interview, the way you come off is huge, right? Behavioral scientists call it the first impression bias, and it is a bias. It's a limitation in human information processing that really causes us to make quick and incomplete observations about other people based on the first piece of information we perceive. This is relative. It's known as a subliminal bias, right? We're not even aware of the fact that we're becoming biased as to people or things, but we are, right? And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Typically, we think of the idea of bias and we think of a negative, right? And many biases are, of course, negative. But oftentimes, it's recognizing that these biases, these subliminal biases, do exist and they impact how we think about things and how we react. For example, somebody shows up to a job interview in jean shorts, right? Cut off jean shorts. I'm pretty sure that you are going to have a different opinion of that individual compared to him coming in a nice suit with a tie and so forth. These are things. Obviously, the fact that he's wearing jean shorts doesn't inherently impact or mean that this person's a lesser candidate. Though, I think there's arguments you could make that, presentability is important, but it's going to impact how you consider them from an intellectual level, right? Their level of knowledge, their educational background, and many, many other things, just because that's the first thing you saw. Similarly speaking, when we make demands, right? When we send our demand letter, that's oftentimes our first impression, right? It's kind of ingrained in claims culture that you get your case, maybe you investigate, maybe you send your demand first, but either way, you're always sending a demand on a subro case. But most of the times, and most of my clients, and frankly, a lot of other law firms that I see and I work with, their demand system is very templatized, right? So it's procedural based. And oftentimes, even through now there's AI technologies that's auto-generating these demand letters. And I encourage my clients, I make all of my attorneys that work with us, approach it differently, right? Your demand letter cannot just be some template document that just has, insert A, B, C, fact pattern, a couple sentences. They're all the same on your letterhead, slap it on, send it off. And why is that, right? Well, it's a great way that demands are getting out. We're doing it promptly. That's huge. But the fact is, when that adverse adjuster, when that opposing counsel receives that demand letter, especially opposing counsel, we want to make sure that our best foot is forward, that we have the best chance of picking that low-hanging fruit, right? There's a lot of these cases that we send a demand on and we're just getting paid, right? These are cases on our end where our clients already tried to do so, and then we get that legal demand and they're paying us. And why is that? A lot of clients, when they first come to us, they say, well, we want to use you to litigate a case. Just litigate, Ashton, file suit. And frankly, if a client tells me that, fine, I'll do it. But I always encourage my clients, give us the chance. There's a lot of adverse parties who, one, these adverse adjusters have been trained. Why settle with the TPA or the insurance company when you'll have the full chance to do so when an attorney's involved? They're going to send you a demand anyway before they file suit, right? So there's still a value just to that letterhead. But also, I believe that it's the way in which my demand letters and my team's demand letters are drafted that have an impact. Of the cases we have that come into our firm, and these are all contested cases where my clients have already sent numerous demands, tried to settle the case. We're resolving about 50% of these prior to ever filing suit, meaning that there's a lot of value in that letter. And to go beyond just the letterhead, I've gone to clients and I've helped them build appropriate claim demand procedures. And one thing I always say, best foot forward. What are we doing? Well, we're not just putting those few sentences in. What we're doing is we are outlining the full claim as much as possible, right? Not necessarily giving bad facts. Some people would argue you should. I'm not down that. I don't go down that path. But I'm outlining my claim in enough detail that when that opposing party takes a look at it, they say, oh no, oh crap, this is serious. This is a real case. I need to take it seriously. Let's resolve it. We want to make our adversaries' life as easy as possible, right? Give them the best justification to say, hey, I don't want to deal with this anymore. This looks like a good case. Let's just pay Ashton. That's my approach. So how do we do that, right? One way we do that was just by including all that information. It's by including addendums or exhibits to our demand, right? I never tell my clients to get written expert reports. That's step one. So I don't want to see a written expert report, but if you have one, you have to produce it anyway. Case is never going to be resolved. Maybe we're talking expert reports. We're talking fire marshal reports, police reports, anything else to add to it. One thing that I've learned that is fantastic is a lot of it is optics, right? It's the optical function. It's what your eyes see. One thing I always love to do is on the first page, whenever possible, I'm including photographs, diagrams, drawings. Why? One, it's persuasive, right? If we can show a photograph, if we point to proofs, we're not just saying photographs. I'm drawing on these photographs. I'm putting red marks, checks, X's, whatever it could be to get that attention. Obviously, it provides an illustration. It gives support for our claim, but also when that adverse adjuster has reviewed 100 demand letters in the last 3 days, and they're all the same, frankly, I've spoken to plenty of opposing adjusters, and my clients who are liability adjusters tell me, yeah, frankly, we really just don't read the demand. We see the demand, we look at the claim amount, we file it away, and we wait for next steps. My demands they're actually looking at. Somebody looks at that letter and sees a big photograph, and that's new. That's a fantastic way to get their attention because we want their attention. We want to get the adverse party's attention. We want to stick with it. And we want to put our best foot forward so they realize, you know what? This is going to be one of those low-hanging fruit cases. Let's just pay up or let's just negotiate now. Saving a ton of time, money, energy for my client, facilitating a good recovery for me and my firm, of course. So we try to find those ways to creatively include that information. Example being, I do quite a bit of work with misdig claims, which we'll actually do a full podcast on. What a misdig claim is, it's like an 811 claim, they call it also. I represent telecommunications utility companies. And frankly, all the time, way more than you would ever imagine, contractors are using heavy equipment, excavating, augering right into utility lines, right? Be it electrical, telecommunications, what have you. And in doing so, those parties, assuming that it was appropriately marked, we have a claim against them, or the marking company. The process, which could be it's going to be a whole podcast in and of itself, is that the contractor, the person doing construction work, calls 811, which is Digger's hotline. Digger's hotline then informs the telecommunication company or their vendor, oftentimes one of the marking companies, on behalf of them to get out there and mark where their lines are. They then mark it with either flags, drawings, spray paint, at which point showing where it is. And then there's an area of tolerance, oftentimes about 3 feet from center, on that marking, saying that, hey, contractor, if you're going to dig and excavate here, you need to do it by hand within this area of tolerance. That means with a shovel, usually. You can't just dig down with an excavator, a backhoe, an auger within this area. Otherwise, you're going to be responsible for the damage. Instead, you need to expose the utility and then proceed accordingly. So that's the process. And these cases can be really, really difficult to understand. So a lot of times with those, I'll have half a dozen photographs. I'll have 2 pages walking through. Here's an arrow pointing to this. Look, this is where you struck it. Look, here's the markings. Can you see that orange spray paint? Oh, look, over here, there's a circle with an X in it. What does this mean? Which there's all these meanings that these marking companies put down with the spray paint, which we'll discuss in the next podcast. And what happens there is, in doing so, I'm able to give like a rubric for here's what the markings mean. Here's an outline of the photo. So when that adverse party gets that demand, the stage is set, right? Everything is ready. We're ready to roll. And next thing you know, either one, they're going to deny it. And I'm going to know full well, guess what? Time to litigate. We don't need to waste any more time with back and forth because I put everything forward and we got nothing, right? Or they're going to come forward with an offer or come back and give me something else, right? So in the end, I always say with demands, best foot forward, do it quickly, get that demand out immediately. That's another tip that I go through in my presentation. This slide is called, it says just ask, right? And it's the idea that we need to stop worrying about overthinking cases. We don't need everything to get out the demand, right? Some attorneys I work with, you'll see adjusters, well, I need this little bit more information before I send the demand. I always say, hey, as long as you have enough, put it out there, build your argument and send the demand and go from there. So it doesn't mean that, I don't mean when we talk about first impression that this is to discourage anyone from moving quickly, right? We don't always need it. We're never going to have everything, right? We're going to put our best foot forward, make that ask. Another reason not to delay the demand or not send a demand in general is, I give you the example, and I gave you all the example in a recent podcast about the cow in the road case. So I won't give the full story, but brief synopsis is, new client sends me a case. I'm trying to get market business from a different firm. The other firm shut it down. The other firm did an excellent job, by the way. They sent out a private investigator day after the loss to figure out if the fence was broken, allowing the cow to escape that our truck hit, about $500,000. No, nothing there. Client shut it down. They said, Ashton, take a look, see if you can do anything here. All right. My thought is probably not, but I already opened the case. Might as well send a demand. You never know what happens. Sent that demand, despite the fact that their private investigator went out day after the loss and noticed no breakage in the fence, assuming it was just a cow in heat that jumped the fence. Happens. That's not the farmer's responsibility in this jurisdiction. Sent the demand. 2 days later, I get an offer, full payment, like $500,000 with a phone call, right, and a demand letter. The beauty there was that after the fact, talked to the adjuster, and she told me, well, the reason why we're paying you is because the farmer was there the day after the loss. He was following the truck driver, noticed a gaping hole in his fence after the accident occurred, repaired it right there. So an hour after the loss, the fence was already repaired. Reminding me always and telling my clients, just ask, send that demand quickly, promptly. Don't delay. Don't think that you have to have all the facts to send a demand. You don't. But when you do send a demand, include the best information you have and outline it with photographs, visuals, and information. Don't just send BS template demands. It's all the same. That's a piece of advice there. Another thing to keep in mind for all of my clients who are insurance companies or self-insured is there are some amazing TPAs, right? We represent most of them. Amazing subrogation vendors. We also represent most of them out there. But you are still the quarterback, and that TPA or that subro vendor is your running back, right? So we need to make sure that when we're handing that ball off to your running back, when we're working with these vendors, that they have the right interests aligned. And there's always a concern when I get cases from some of these vendors and I see, what have you done? And I look at the case. We're 5 days before the SOL. And what's happened? Well, we've had 23 of the same demand letters sent out every 2 weeks since the onset of the claim, 5 days after the loss. Well, glad you got on it right away. Beautiful 5 days after the loss. Great time to send a demand letter. But a template demand after the second, and this is statistically proven, I've ran the data, after the second demand, the likelihood of their just perspective changing because you have a demand letter out there is almost nil, right? Send two demands. This is what I tell all my clients. Take the time, investigate the case, build a bomb-throwing demand letter, include those photographs, put it out there, make the demand, solicit a response, follow up with phone calls. You always need to pick up the phone and call. Okay, they don't respond, try another one. Why not? 30 days later, send another demand. It does happen. It has happened that letter is just lost in translation. It's somewhere. The fax machine didn't answer, whatever could have occurred. But after that, right, there's no good to spending 2 years sending demand letters. Take the time. That's when you need to realize either escalate it or take a new approach. If it's subject or viable for litigation, don't wait until another 6 months later. Send it to counsel right away. If it's not subject for litigation, still consider sending to counsel because that demand letter works. I don't need every case I get to be something viable for suit. I can still create more attention with my law firm letterhead. In the same way, try new things, pick up the phone. But still, the fact that a lot of these subro vendors, their approach to subro is, I'm going to send a letter, then I'm going to send another letter. It's going to be the same letter. Then I'm going to send another one. Same damn letter, nothing new. Maybe I'll call every once in a while. Maybe I won't. Who knows? It's not the right approach. So I always encourage all of my clients. There's some amazing vendors out there. There's also some not so amazing ones. Same with law firms, same with everything, same with insurance carriers for that matter. So I always like to make sure that when it comes to subrogation, we want to make absolutely sure that our interests are aligned. There's this strange thing when it comes to subro vendors where, there's certain situations where when we try to chase the lowest contingency fee, you get what you ask for, right? And the problem is that I've seen clients who they have this tiny little contingency fee with their debt collector, with their subro vendor. And guess what that means? That means that they can never find an attorney to litigate the case. They're never going to tell you that, right? They're going to say, of course I can handle it at 12%. That's as much as you should be paying for subrogation claims. Well, guess what that means? They're going to tell you to close down that case that's probably very viable, that if you had on at 25%, they could have then found counsel, they could have litigated that case, and they could have gotten you back 75% of your claim. But because you're deciding to pay them that low 12%, 15%, well, guess what? They're never going to tell you, hey, close the case because we can't find counsel. But the truth is, no attorney in their right mind is going to take and litigate a complex subrogation case at a 15% contingency fee. So, that's not to be self-serving, but I think that still plays in here, that I encourage all my clients, make sure that if your vendors are just, if their practice is, we just send a bunch of letters and then we tell you to close it because it's not viable. Think deeper, make sure that you are taking an active role managing not just your vendors, your attorneys too, right? I want my clients to be following up with me consistently, making sure that they are happy. That's part of all. I go on by quarterly calls, at least quarterly, with every single client I represent. We just have conversations. See are you happy? What can we do better? And so forth. Make sure that you're taking that role, ensuring that you're working with the right people, and ensure that you don't have this weird, almost just antithetical dynamic wherein you think that you're getting the best deal because my contingency rate's low. But instead, you're just encouraging your vendor to not push those cases forward because they don't have the ability, right? There's no way to do so. So make sure that it's structured the right way. Be strategic in everything that we do. Important to note. Secondly is the idea related to first impression. Well, before I jump into this, I want to say first impressions apply across the board. So I'm really fascinated in kind of the hard science of psychology, and when it comes to some unique things about human anatomy and how we can impact the subconscious and subliminal messaging through different things. Like in first impression principle is one of those things. right? So a lot of times, if we want to get someone's attention, have them remember us, well, one way to easily do that is to take advantage of this principle. We do that by being the first contact of the day. Statistically speaking, the earlier in the day that we contact somebody and we discuss something with them, there's a better chance that they're going to remember that going forward. We're going to make not necessarily a better first impression, but we're going to have a more lasting impression. What does that mean? That means when I send demand letters via email that I want to have an impression, I want to have an impact, whether good or bad, I'm trying to send earlier in the day. If we're interviewing, right, and we want to be remembered, we know there's a ton of other applicants. I want to be that first applicant. There's other arguments to be the last applicant, but either way, for first impression purposes, it has an impact. That's the thing to remember. It is an important human bias that we all have. Aside from that, I wanted to briefly talk about the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Now, what is the anchoring heuristic? What that says, it basically says that your adversary, the other party, is going to create a visual anchor, right? A psychological anchor based upon the number that you demand. What anchoring does is it pretty much in practice, it's the reason why plaintiffs' attorneys, right? Think about those ambulance chasers out there demanding, $1 million on a case with 40,000 in medical specials and pre-existing conditions. The reason is that even though they know full well they're never going to get $1 million on this case, they're going to ask for it. And the reason is because the anchoring and adjustment heuristic has shown that by demanding more money, the end result statistically is going to end up being higher. You, as the adverse liability adjuster, are going to be willing to pay more, even if some pie in the sky crazy number is demanded. There's been really interesting perspectives on this, and psychiatrists, psychologists, whether they're in their ivory tower or down in the basement behind the copier machines, they run these interesting studies, right? Randomized blind studies. And one really fascinates me. And I actually when I give this presentation, I have a series of like 10 different examples I like to give. But one of my favorite is they took a group of individuals, 2 randomized samplings, and they did this test 1 million times. Well, probably not, let's say 100 times, who knows? But they put them in separate rooms and they asked them a distinct but very similar question. First group was asked, at what age do you think Mahatma Gandhi died? Was it before or after 140, and what was the age? The other group was asked, at what age do you think Mahatma Gandhi died? Was it before or after 70 years of age, and what was the age that he died? So same exact question. The only difference was 140 years old or 70. So when you think about that rationally, 140, no one's ever lived to 140, at least not that I'm aware of. It's an unreasonable number. It should have absolutely zero impact on the final number that those participants come up with when they estimate at what age they thought Gandhi died. But in the end, across the board, those people who were primed, and they call it priming, with the 140-year-old number, estimated a significantly higher, between 5 and 20% higher age of death than those primed with the 70-year-old number. And they've done countless studies in different kind of contexts for this. And it showed across the board that just by priming, by putting forward a higher number, it impacts the willingness to go to a higher number or to value something higher. Interestingly enough, they actually have done a ton of studies that just by saying a bigger number, not even related, you can impact the end result or the number and the reasonableness to go higher. There was a study where, where the individual talked about, I have 100 million reasons why this case should resolve. At which point they then looked to see what was the final resolution on the same claim. And it happened to be that, not a huge statistical relevance, but a significant enough relevance that it showed in the stats that just by saying 100 million reasons, it caused the other party to have an impact and to pay more. So it's really a fascinating thing. It's not on every case, of course. If I use 100 million, I just say it all the time. It's not going to cause everyone to, to start paying me a ton of money. But it has statistical relevance, and that's why we discuss this. And one reason I like to put this forward is all of us who handle claims, which there are liability adjusters and defense attorneys that listen to this podcast, you don't want to be subject to it, right? If we know about it, we can defend against it. So just know you don't want to be the one that gets got on this. Also, speaking of that, subrogation. So if I'm a plaintiff's attorney, well, how am I using this? Plaintiff's attorneys, they're using it by just finding additional damages to add. I have a case, sometimes I'll do JPAs, right? Joint prosecution agreements, and I'll represent the claimant on a work comp subrogation case as well as the comp carrier. Oftentimes we do that because maybe the case just wasn't good enough, a slip and fall, but I just feel confident in it. I want to push it. At which point I represent both in those states where we can through appropriate conflict waivers, represent both the injured worker and the comp carrier to pursue that third party. I have an example. I have one. I have $10,000 medical special. I like the case, but that individual was so, all these pre-existing issues, only 10K in medical specials, all of the above. This case, best case scenario, worth about 25K, right? If everything goes right, 2x, maybe 2.5x medical specials. What do? Well, I take a look and I realize, hey, the guy hasn't worked for, 2 years beforehand, but whatever. I can still say that he wanted to work and he had a wage loss claim. I'm not lying, but I'm making this all clear. They know the truth, but I can at least ask for it, right? I can come up with a viable argument. I'd probably lose it, but I put that forward. I put forward future pain and suffering, potential future pain, all of these other items that I could put in because there are a lot of fluid damages I'm putting forward. On that case, I demanded $275K. In the end, my client only wanted about $10,000 back. I was able to get it done for $75,000. Why? Because I demanded that high amount. It changed the anchoring point. The adverse was way more willing. If I had an initial demand at $50,000, yeah, there's no chance, right? Even at $100,000, they wouldn't have gone to 75. But because I demanded 275, it created more room. It put more value on the case just due to the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, not due to the true facts or anything further. Subro, it's a lot more difficult to use this because numbers are more static, right? ABC Insurance Company paid out this much money, right? We can't just add in additional, and insurance companies don't have pain and suffering. We're working with some plaintiff's attorney. I'm sure some of you adjusters may disagree, but that doesn't exist. There's no viable pain and suffering for the insurance adjuster. Instead, we can sometimes look at other items, other agenda items. For my self-insured clients, as an example, self-insured auto claims, I will oftentimes tell the motor carrier that's self-insured, let's ask for loss of use, very viable damage, downtime loss of use. Let's base on lost revenue, which is typically higher. Beautiful. Added some additional damages. Further, not just that, diminution in value. I love diminution in value. Diminution in value is really hard to sustain. Only Georgia is the only state where there's true case law in place showing that you can get paid diminution in value. That said, I've recovered diminution in value in almost every state so far because it's ambiguous. Why is it ambiguous? Well, it's because the claims are usually so small that nobody's really tried these things, right? So there's no case law in point. So we have the ability to argue, okay, sure, there's no case law in point both ways. So, but for that, we can recover, pay up. So we're adding that into claims as well. So this is oftentimes a way to jack up our demand amount by, 10, 15% by combining those damages, right? Even if maybe on some of these cases, we're writing them off quickly, we're still able to bring them up to increase our claim amount. So I always tell my clients, don't come forward with that, reduced demand. I hate that. Sometimes I'll have clients come to me and say, hey, the case is garbage. We should just get our initial demand off at 50%. So, absolutely not. We're going to ask for the world, and then we could very quickly start negotiating. I want to try to get an offer from them before I make a move. But sometimes, sure, unilateral reductions can make sense, but I still want to make that huge demand at the onset. So always ask for everything we can, more difficult than Subro with static numbers and damages. But otherwise, we can look at it anyway. Look at ACV v. RCV. Many states, we only get to recover actual cash value. But that being said, there are arguments. Some states we actually recover replacement costs, which frankly, a lot of attorneys and judges just don't know that, but we're recovering replacement costs on cases, every day. But even in those states where it is ACV, there's still arguments that RCV should be recoverable. And assuming we're not, being unethical, there's some states where we just can't, where we know it's ACV. But in those states where there's ambiguity, we're demanding RCV, which can be significantly more, demanding of depreciation costs. And we're able to increase that demand, 20%. So always something to keep in mind. Obviously this isn't an across the board thing, but case by case, always be thinking about how to increase that amount, to ask for as much as possible so that we're putting that best foot forward and we're impacting things by considering the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. So, I mean, I could go on and on about this, but in the end, just to recap, I want all of you listeners, everyone in the subrogation industry, should just remember, your demand letter should not be some template document that you just send, a dozen of a day. That's the same thing with a few different words in a sentence. Instead, we should take the 10 minutes, right? Because that's all it takes. Take the 10 minutes to run through that demand, to input actual language, to make sure it's well written, right? That's a big thing. There's nothing more embarrassing than that demand letter where there's spelling errors or font's different. I hate that. Remember that. Make sure the font's consistent because you look disorganized, like you don't care when your font's different or the sizing or the actual something's improperly italicized in a document, right? Make sure that's consistent. First impression, right? Same with emails. When you're sending an email to the other side, they're judging you based on how you write. So if you're friends with this person, if you know, I don't care. If I see emails with a smiley face because I know this adjuster's been talking to me for, 5-10 years on different cases, fine. We may have that relationship. But when I see an initial demand go off or somebody communicating with another party and they're just using LOLs, JKs, acronyms, spelling errors, not capitalizing correctly, weird spacing. I don't know what it is with some attorneys and weird spacing. But in the end, just make sure any email correspondence should be the same as a written correspondence. And we should remember that the impression of the other party is key. It's going to have an impact. So everything should be professional, especially that first letter, especially that demand letter. Remembering that when we take that time to get their attention, we are going to bear the fruits of our labor. It's worth the time. The letter, put it all in there, outline, make your adversary want to pay you. Make it so they realize that this person is willing to put the time into a demand like this. Well, first off, they got my attention. It's kind of cool. Secondly, if they're willing to do this, think about what they're going to be willing to do litigating this case or pushing this case. If I want to settle one, sadly, people don't like to work that much. So make them not want to work by defending against you and just pay you. So there's a lot of reasons to do that. Keep these things in mind. I encourage you on one thing, take the time with the demand, and that's it. So that's what I got for you today. Again, this is a fun podcast of Ashton, myself, just talking at you, which, oftentimes we try to have guests on. I'm not going to have guests every time. Sometimes maybe I just want to hear myself talk. Sometimes I just want to talk at you about a certain topic. But either way, I appreciate everybody. If you have any topic ideas, I always encourage you, reach out to me. Let me know some interesting topics. We're always looking for more to talk about. Next podcast we do, it'll be on those 811, those misdig claims. I think it's a fascinating type of case, something that's really interesting, even for those that don't handle those types of claims. But in the end, that's what I got for you. So everyone, thank you. Ashton Kirsch signing off from this episode of the Subrogation Support Network podcast. Until next time, have a great week.